Okay, so the first custom mechanic that I'm going to describe is the elevator that I made that actually gets the player up through to the end of the level through the second route that I've showcased. So it's pretty simple. Basically, when the player walks on this elevator, if they will collide with a box collider, and when the player does collide with a box collider, and the elevator will rise. And when the player walks off of the elevator, it will take a second, and then it will go when the overlap ends, it will go back down to where it started. So let's look at the blueprint for this item. So the elevator platform blueprint is fairly straightforward. It is really just a static mesh component of a cube scaled to 4.25 on the X, 4.75 on the Y, and 25.25, sorry, on the Z. And it really just is that, and then it has a box collider on top of it. The box extents on the X are 33.246, on the Y 36.68, and on the Z it's 45.322. And it's very, very simple. So there's a timeline component that I created, and basically it starts on 0 and value 0, and then it goes for about 2 seconds, and on the 2 second mark it goes to value 1. And the entire blueprint is about 5 seconds, which is why there's like sort of a delay when you walk off of it, right? It's because it has to kind of go through that entire loop. But this is a very, very simple event graph here. Really just on component begin overlap. I get the player character. I check to see if the other actor actually overlapping it is the player character, and if so, then I'm going to play that elevator move timeline that I just showed you. And all that is using this timeline as the alpha, going into a lerp node here, and taking the initial location, which is actually set on begin play. It's just get actor location, and then it's set to a variable called init location. So it takes that variable, puts that into the A, and then adds what I calculated to be 595 on the Z axis to that for the B location, and it just sets it to that location here. And then off on event overlap, end overlap checks to see again if that actor was the player character, and if that's true, it just reverses it and does the same thing. So that's pretty much the elevator platform mechanic. Okay, so the next mechanic that we're going to talk about is entering the car. So there's like two components to this. There is a boolean on the player character, and then there is logic in the car as well. But I'll just kind of run through how it works. So basically the player character has to walk into a box collider that surrounds the car, and depending on whether or not the player character has the key to the car, they'll get a different prompt. So right now I don't have the key to the car, and if I walk up to it, it'll tell me that I need the key to escape because I'm overlapping the box collider and I do not have the key. But if I go ahead and I go to my player character, let me stop this. If I go ahead and go to my player blueprint and I switch the has key boolean to true, then I'll get a different prompt. And see, I'll walk up to the car and it'll say press Q to enter the vehicle. And if I do, I will be able to get in the vehicle and I will be told I made it. Now let's look at how this works. Okay, so let's talk about the logic of how this works. So first of all, there's an input action called use item, which is pretty universal. For the most part, I use Q as the use item button, and it'll check to see if certain conditions are met before it does different things, and we'll explore those in different blueprints as well. But for now, the input action use item, if the player presses Q, it's going to check this boolean to see if the player is near the car, which we will see in a second. What triggers that, and if it is true that the player is near the car, it is going to check again if the player has the car key, and if that is true, it is going to set the visibility of the player character's mesh to not visible. It's going to set this game over variable to true, which is actually what controls whether or not the game over UI that you saw briefly pops up. It's going to first set that to true, and then it's going to get the player controller, and it is going to possess the escape car variable, which is on our player here, the escape car variable, which is just basically it's a variable of the type of the sedan, which is the car that you get in, and it's going to possess that pawn, basically. So that's how you get into the pawn. It looks like the character just jumped into the car. No animations yet, but this is just a level design. But anyway, so and then it's going to create that widget, that you made it widget, which is the game over widget, and add it to the viewport. And it is going to, it actually has some extra logic here that creates like a fade out, which basically fades the screen to black, but that's not really relevant for this, this mechanic. Anyway, over on the car side, if on component begin overlap, it basically, this blueprint is pretty straightforward. So there's a box component. This is actually just the the Unreal Engine's standard car model, but I added a box component to it. So when that box is overlapped with, we're going to cast to our adventure character, and we're going to set near car, which is that Boolean from over here. We're going to set that to true, and if it's true, obviously we're going to do all these things if the player character has the car key. But when that happens, we're also going to create the car prompt widget, and we're going to set that to this variable car prompt that exists on the blueprint here and add it to the viewport. So that's that little notification that you need to press Q to get into the car. And then on component end overlap, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to cast to the adventure character. We're going to set near car to false so that the logic for input action use item is not activated. And we're going to remove the car prompt from the viewport, remove it from parent right here. So that's how that works. Okay, so the next mechanic we're going to look at is the reading of files. So there are a few side quests in this level. One of them is reading all of the files from the bookshelf. So this one's also very simple. The player walks up to the bookshelf. They're prompted with the use action, which is Q in our case. And if they read file, it basically indicates how many files have been read on the UI up there. So this time I read one, and it adds one. When I walk up to it, it won't allow me to do it again. It only allows me to do it once. So let's look at how this one works. Okay, so the logic for this one only exists really in the bookshelf blueprint. So this is the same as most of the other ones, right? We have a box collider over a static mesh that we can collide with and trigger events. So in the event graph, though, we have on begin play, we create a read file UI widget, and we actually promoted that, turned that return value, which is the read file UI widget that we have in game, and we set it to a variable called read file prompt. Now on begin overlap of that box, we actually have we just check to see if that other actor is the player character, and if so, we're going to add that prompt to the viewport, and we're also going to enable input. The reason why we're enabling input, let me go down here, is that we have the access to use the use item button, which we know is Q, when the player is overlapping with that box component. So if the player uses that item, presses Q, right, then we're going to remove the read file prompt, and we're going to cast to the player character, and the player character actually has a variable called files read, and what we do there is we increment on that. We add 1 to the files read variable, and then we set that variable to the value of whatever it is plus 1. And we also disable collision. Now this is very important because we don't want to have to do this more than once. So we disable collision on the box after the player actually reads the file, and we play the sound of the page turning at the location. Now if the player doesn't do that, if the player walks away without pressing Q and they end overlap, basically it does the same thing where it just will check to see if that thing that ended the overlap was the player, and if so, it'll remove the prompt from the viewport, but also it will disable input, so you won't be able to actually read the file if you're not standing in that box collider. Now I will actually note here, I'll just show the UI here because I actually didn't show this on the you made it part, But this is basically, the UI is very straightforward here. There's two parts to it. There's just the prompt for the read file, and then there's actually the player UI, which has this files read text here, and that is linked to, it's binded to a function called getFile, which really all it does is grab the player character, cast to player character, and then it takes the files read and it sets it to another variable within this UI widget, and then it appends that variable to a text value or a string value, sorry, where one part of it is just files read, as you can see here, and then it appends the value to the B portion, and then it turns it into a text variable and returns it, and then shows up on your UI. So that's how that works. Okay, so the next one we're going to look at is actually the flashlight and its uses. So basically, the flashlight is very simple. You have to pick it up. It's an item that you pick up in the level, and so you pick it up, and there's a prompt that tells you that you found the flashlight. And if you noticed on the right, a new piece of UI pops up telling you that you have to press L to turn on the flashlight. It's a silly button to press, but that's just how it works. So if you press L, you can kind of toggle on and off the flashlight. Actually, should probably change that to toggle, but yeah, if you press L, you can toggle on and off the flashlight, and that's pretty much how it works. So there's a couple of blueprints for this. First is obviously the flashlight itself. The flashlight is a mesh that I created in Blender, and it's just a very simple kind of flashlight mesh. It's not anything special, but it has a sphere collider around it, which the player overlaps with to pick it up. And let's see. The flashlight does a couple of things. So first, it has actually a rotator. That's what makes it move around on the map, the way that you see it rotating. And how that works is there's a float variable called rotation speed, and on a tick, we times the delta seconds, variable from the tick, which is the time that from the game started, counting in seconds, and we multiply that by the rotation speed, and then we have this make rotator node here, which I plug that value into the Y and the Z on it, because that's just kind of how I wanted it to rotate on the Y and the Z. And then we add actor local rotation and plug that make rotator value into the delta rotation. So that's how you get the rotation there on the flashlight. And how to get the player to pick it up? Well, pretty simple. Obviously we check to see if that other actor is the adventure character we cast to it. And then really important, we want to add that has flashlight bool to the player, and we're going to turn that on, because the player is going to be able to use the flashlight only if that bool is set to on. So that's very important. We play a pickup sound at the location. We create a flashlight widget with the flashlight widget, which actually I named it flashlight widget, so it says widget twice. And that's that little prompt that says you got the flashlight at the bottom of the screen, and it adds it to the viewport. And then there's a little bit of a delay, and then we remove that prompt from the viewport and destroy the flashlight actor. Now, the important part here comes on the UI, where it basically is bound to a function called show flashlight prompt, which checks to see if the adventure character has that flashlight boolean on that we just talked about. And if it's true, it'll show the flashlight prompt. And here it says, you can see it says press L to turn on flashlight, and that's what you see in the corner. There's an input action, set flashlight toggle, or flashlight toggle, here in the player character. And if the player has the flashlight, again, that bool is very important because it checks a lot of things, but if the player has the flashlight and it's true, we go into a flip-flop node here, and then we just set the intensity on a light bulb or spotlight on the character. So that's where that's another additional component that I added to the character. It's just a spotlight that projects from the character's body to show that the flashlight. And then it takes that spotlight component and basically sets the intensity between 45,000 and 0, depending on which toggle you're on. So if you hit it and the flashlight's not on, it'll set it to 45,000. If you hit it and the flashlight is off, it'll set it back to 0. And it also sets these booleans flashlight on and off, flashlight on to true or false.